On the 19th of May, 1536, at the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mounted the scaffold. Her last words were about King Henry VIII, the husband who had had her condemned to death on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. Under such circumstances, what she said was extraordinary.
I cry mercy to God and to the King. And I beg the people to pray for the King. For he is a good, gentle, gracious, and amiable prince.
Once indeed, Henry had been gracious and gentle, but his steely determination to divorce his first wife and to marry Anne, which Anne herself had encouraged and inspired, had coarsened and brutalized him. Anne had helped to create a new Henry who would change England forever. Now she was to be one of his first victims. The story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is one of the great tragic love stories of all time. But it's also rather strange. It's a story of a king who would risk everything, his throne, his kingdom, his immortal soul, to marry the woman that he loved, only to send her to the scaffold a mere 3 years later.
Everyone involved, from Henry's councillors to foreign ambassadors, was surprised, appalled, and above all puzzled by events. For this was an affair which turned Henry from an affable but forgettable king, who'd actually achieved very little, into the tyrannical figure who reshaped a nation and imprinted himself indelibly on the pages of history. But behind this extraordinary transformation is the all-too-human story of a man changed and warped by a passionate love affair and a bitter divorce.
I promise to take you as my sole mistress.
I shall find 1,000 to declare the marriage good and indissoluble.
This Anne has so perverted him that he does not seem the same man.
Here, in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, is an insider account by someone who was witness to the beginning of the whole affair. His name was George Cavendish, and he was a personal attendant on Henry's leading minister, Cardinal Wolsey. In his Life of Wolsey, Cavendish describes Henry's secret infatuation with one of his wife, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn.
Her excellent gesture and behaviour did excel all other, insomuch as the king began to kindle the brand of amours, which was not known to any person, nay, scantly to her own person.
But Henry didn't keep his secret to himself for long. The person that he told, however, wasn't Anne, but Wolsey, his trusted minister, friend, and confidant. For Henry had discovered that he got a rival for Anne Boleyn's affections, young Lord Percy, the heir to the great earldom of Northumberland. And Henry wanted him out of the way.
Lord Percy would resort for his pastime unto the Queen's chamber, and there would fall in dalliance among the Queen's maidens, being most conversant with Mistress Anne Boleyn, so that there grew such a secret love between them that at length they were ensured together, intending to marry. The which thing came to the king's knowledge, who was then much offended, wherefore he revealed his secret affection unto my Lord Cardinal, and consulted with him to infringe the pre-contract between them.
For Wolsey, it was all in a day's work. Cardinal and priest though he was, he had a long-term mistress of his own and an acknowledged son by her. Henry had had mistresses too, including Anne's own sister. None of them had mattered much, and they'd been married off to convenient courtiers as soon as Henry tired of them. Why, Wolsey must have thought, should Anne be any more significant? But for once, the cardinal miscalculated. Anne was different.
Compared to most women of the court, Anne was unusually well educated. This is Hever Castle in Kent, her family seat. Today, it houses a fine collection of Tudor portraits, including this one of Anne herself.
But Anne wasn't brought up here in England. Instead, her father sent her abroad to a succession of continental royal households to learn the poise, polish and easy command of French that ensured she stood out on her return to the English court at the age of 20. Anne was also highly intelligent and pious. This is her Book of Hours. And during her time abroad, she'd been introduced to the movement for religious reform, which sought to renew Christianity by return to its sources in Scripture.
Henry liked the company of intelligent people. One of his closest friends was England's leading intellectual, Thomas More.
The king would have me into his private room. And there, sometime in matters of astronomy, geometry, divinity, and other such faculties, and sometime in his worldly affairs, to sit and confer with him. Sometime we would climb up onto the roof, there to consider with him the diversities, courses, motions, and operations of the stars and the planets.
But if Henry and More were receptive to new trends in the arts and sciences, they took a very different attitude to the new religious ideas being advanced by Martin Luther and his followers on the continent. Luther pointed out that the Bible contained no mention of the Pope, and he questioned the legitimacy of the papacy. Henry was appalled, and with More's help he wrote this, the first book by an English king since Alfred the Great.
In the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, Henry marshalled his considerable theological expertise to mount a powerful counterattack on Martin Luther.
For the Assertio, Henry was entitled Defender of the Faith by a grateful Pope.
So Henry and Anne were well matched. Both were intelligent, well-educated, polished, and fascinated by theological argument, though here Henry's taste was conservative, as Anne's were to prove to be reformist. But at this point, Henry was more interested in Anne's body than her mind, and to get that, Percy had to be got out of the way, which was Wolsey's job. And Wolsey, as Cavendish reports, subjected the young man to a brutal, semi-public dressing down.
I wonder not a little at thy peevish folly, that thou would tangle and ensure Anne Boleyn, that foolish girl of the court. Dost thou not consider the state that God hath called you unto in this world? For after the death of thy noble father, thou art most like to inherit and possess one of the worthiest earldoms of this realm. But now behold what you have done through your willfulness. You have not only offended your natural father, but also your most gracious sovereign lord, the king.
Poor Percy burst into tears, and, his resistance broken, was quickly married off to another heiress. But what of Anne? Anne, it seems certain, had been really in love with Percy, and, as Cavendish reports, she vowed her revenge on Wolsey for his meddling.
If it ever lay in her power, she would work the cardinal as much displeasure as he had her.
Wolsey had made an enemy. Just how dangerous he could not have imagined.
On the 18th of May, 1527, the new Spanish ambassador in London made a sensational coded report to the Emperor Charles V, the nephew of Henry's queen, Catherine of Aragon.
The king has secretly assembled certain bishops and lawyers that they may sign a declaration to the effect that his marriage to the queen is null and void on account of her having been his brother's wife.
The ambassador was well informed. The day before, Henry's minister, Cardinal Wolsey, had indeed convened a secret trial at his London palace. Its aim was to dissolve Henry's 18-year-old marriage to Catherine of Aragon, quickly, quietly, and with minimum fuss.
The Spanish ambassador believed the secret trial to be Wolsey's work, but I doubt if that's right. In all of Wolsey's voluminous papers, there's no trace of any preparation for the case. Instead, it was Henry himself who picked and briefed the leading lawyer to the tribunal.
The case he presented to Wolsey was based on a single verse from the Bible, taken from the book of Leviticus.
And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless.
Henry, of course, had taken his brother's wife. Catherine had originally been married to Henry's elder brother Arthur, who was then heir to the throne. But Arthur died soon after the marriage, and Catherine was quickly betrothed to Henry instead. Their union had the blessing of the Pope, who had issued a special dispensation which stated that in this case Leviticus did not apply. But nearly 20 years later, Catherine and Henry had failed to produce a son. This, Henry's hand-picked lawyer argued, was proof that the king's marriage was offensive to God. The Pope had been wrong to allow it. The only remedy was to end it immediately.
But then Wolsey dropped a bombshell. Instead of deciding for the king, as Henry expected and Catherine feared, Wolsey pronounced the case too difficult for summary judgment and adjourned the court to enable him to consult expert opinion. The delay was fatal. There was now no question of keeping the divorce under wraps or of settling it in England. Instead, and in the full glare of European publicity, it would have to be referred to Rome.
What Wolsey did not know was that Rome was under attack by the mutinous army of the Emperor Charles V. Charles was fighting the French and their papal ally for control of Italy, and he was winning. But he had omitted to pay his mercenary troops, and so they decided to pay themselves by looting Rome.
The sack of Rome was a violent, brutal affair, and Pope Clement was forced to flee for his very life along the heavily fortified, elevated walkway that still connects the Vatican to the almost impregnable papal fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo here.
Pope Clement now found himself a virtual prisoner of Charles V, who was not above taking advantage of his army's bad behaviour.
By referring the case to Rome, Wolsey had, unwittingly, made Henry's divorce a pawn of European power politics, and it would be decided not so much by the Pope as by whoever had the upper hand in Italy. For the moment, that was the Emperor Charles V, and he was Catherine's nephew.
And there was another difficulty. When Wolsey wrote this letter to Pope Clement, he presented the case as a matter of the king's conscientious scruples.
I have already told you how the king, partly by assiduous learning and study, and partly by conference with theologians, has found his conscience somewhat burdened by his present marriage. He considers it would be offensive to God and man were he to persist in it.
But at some point, the Vatican got hold of documents which told a very different story. Private letters written by Henry to Anne Boleyn.
These, the so-called Vatican letters, are the most explosive royal correspondence in English history, for they prove that the origins of the divorce lay not in Henry's conscience, but in his desire for Anne Boleyn. But Anne wasn't going to yield easily. In this letter, Henry pleads with her to have him and become his official, acknowledged mistress, what the French, who have a word for this kind of thing, call maîtresse en titre.
I beseech you now with all my heart, definitely to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us. For necessity compels me to plague you for reply, having been for more than a year now struck by the dart of love, and being uncertain either of failure or of finding a place in your heart and affection. But if it pleases you to do the duty of a true, loyal mistress and friend, and to give yourself, body and heart to me, I promise to take you as my sole mistress, casting off all others out of mind and affection, to serve you only.
Most girls would have leapt at the offer, but not Anne. She was playing for higher stakes. Henry, unused to the word no, only found that her resistance inflamed his passion all the more. Finally, he made the ultimate offer. His unchangeable intention, he vowed, was aut illic, aut nullibi. If not this, then nothing. The this, I am convinced, can only be marriage. And to make sure that the issue of their union was legitimate, Henry further pledged himself to abstain from sex with Anne until the knot was tied.
Henceforward, my heart shall be dedicated to you alone, with a strong desire that my body could be also thus dedicated, which God can do if he pleases, written by the hand of he who in heart, body and will is your loyal and most assured servant, H. 6AB. No other.
Henry's promise was Wolsey's problem. For he knew his political life depended on getting the king the divorce he needed to marry Anne. He now struggled desperately to get control of the divorce proceedings back into his own hands in England. Cavendish witnessed the frantic effort his master put into one crucial letter.
He rose early in the morning, about 4 o'clock, sitting down to write letters into England under the king until 4 o'clock at afternoon, all which season my lord never rose once to piss, nay yet to eat any meat, but continually wrote his letters with his own hand, having all that time his nightcap and kerchief on his head.
Wolsey's scheme was to persuade Clement to issue a so-called decretal commission by which the Pope granted Wolsey irrevocably power to try the divorce in England. Clement resisted doggedly. Wolsey's agents pressed him furiously. But then, circumstances here in Italy began to change in England's favour. In December 1527, Pope Clement escaped from the Castel Sant'Angelo, disguised as a gardener, and fled to the papal stronghold of Orvieto. And soon the French began advancing to victory after victory in Italy. Emboldened by the swing of the balance of power against Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Clement at last issued the decretal commission. But there was a catch. It wasn't granted to Wolsey alone, but jointly to another special papal legate or envoy, Cardinal Campeggio. Campeggio, racked by gout, began his slow journey across Europe to England, followed impatiently by Henry and Anne in their correspondence.
The reasonable request of your last letter causeth me to send you now these news. The legate, which we most desired, arrived at Paris on Sunday, so that I trust by next Monday to hear of his arrival at Calais, and then I trust within a while after to enjoy that which I have so long longed for. To God's pleasure and our both comfort.
Late in 1528, after nearly 6 months' travel, Campeggio finally arrived in London.
On the 22nd of October, Campeggio, accompanied by Wolsey, was formally received at court, and Henry broke with protocol by coming to the foot of the staircase to greet them. First, there was a grand public ceremony in which Charles V was denounced as a tyrant and the common enemy of the Pope and Christendom. Then, the king, accompanied by the 2 cardinals, retired upstairs to the privy chamber, where they remained closeted for several hours. The pre-trial negotiations had begun.
They dragged on for months. Campeggio kept postponing meetings, complaining bitterly of the gout.
Meanwhile, Anne, exiled for decency's sake to the country, was beginning to smell a rat. Were Campeggio and the decretal commission really the solution, or just another device by which the Pope was buying time? There were also worrying developments in Italy itself, where the armies of the Emperor Charles V once more had the upper hand. Would Campeggio turn out to be imperial too, that is, in the pocket of Charles V? Would the Pope?
Henry, on the other hand, trusted in Wolsey's assurances and Campeggio's goodwill. Just to make sure, he'd already dangled the valuable bishopric of Durham in front of the legate as an enormous bribe. He wrote to calm Anne's fears about Campeggio.
I assure you, the unfeigned sickness of this well-willing legate doth somewhat retard his access to your presence. But I trust verily when God shall send him health, he will, with diligence, recompense his demur. For I know well where he hath said, lamenting the saying and bruit that he should be imperial, that it be well known in this matter that he is not imperial. And thus, for lack of time, sweetheart, farewell. Written by the hand which fain would be yours, and so is the heart.
But was Henry's confidence misplaced? Who would prove to have the better grasp of papal politics? The king or the king's mistress? Henry's attempt to divorce Catherine of Aragon was by now the scandal of Europe, and nowhere were events being followed more closely than at the imperial court. For the Emperor Charles V was, as Catherine's nephew and her closest living male relation, himself a leading party to the affair.
Charles's information came in the form of regular coded dispatches from his ambassadors to Henry's court. And these dispatches still exist in the archives here in Vienna, the former capital of the Habsburg Empire that Charles founded. In August 1529, a new imperial ambassador arrived in London. Eustache Chapuis was a lawyer from Savoy. Urbane, witty and intelligent, he quickly established remarkably close relationships with both King Henry and Queen Catherine.
Chapuis had arrived in England at a critical moment. A month before, the trial of Henry's divorce, which the king had thought was in the bag, had collapsed. Catherine had been a far more compelling witness than Henry, whilst Campeggio, proving himself to be imperialist at last, had, in effect, adjourned the trial back to Rome. After 2 years and a vast expenditure of money, effort and political capital, Henry was back to square one and was still married, though deeply reluctantly, to Catherine. The Lord failed him. It was time to try a fresh tack, theology, and Chapuis was the first to get wind of the new approach.
Chapuis was witness to a painful quarrel one day at dinner when Catherine accused the king of neglect.
The king said that it was impossible to visit the Queen's apartment because he was not her husband. He had consulted learned opinion, and there was agreement that the marriage was invalid. He will, he said, collect the evidence and send it to Clement.
If the Pope does not in conformity with these opinions declare our marriage null and void, then I will denounce the Pope as a heretic and marry whom I please.
But Catherine would fight theology with theology.
For each doctor and lawyer who might decide in your favour against me, I shall find 1,000 to declare the marriage good and indissoluble.
But if Henry were to try a new approach to the divorce, where would that leave the man who was so closely identified with the old, Wolsey? Wolsey's job as minister was to do what Henry wanted. For the first time, he'd failed. There was also, as Chapuis was quick to discover, Anne Boleyn's old grudge against Wolsey and her new power to give it effect.
The king's affection for La Boleyn increases daily. If the said Lady Anne, his concubine, chooses, the cardinal will soon be dismissed and his affair settled, for she happens to be the person in all his kingdom who hates him most and has spoken and acted most against him.
For nearly 2 decades, Wolsey had managed all Henry's affairs. The king called him friend, a much stronger word then than now. Despite the failure of Wolsey's divorce strategy, the cardinal still had influence over Henry, if he could get to see him. But for long weeks after the collapse of the divorce trial, Wolsey was banished from the court, whilst Henry and Anne enjoyed the pleasures of the chase during an extended hunting progress.
Finally, in September 1529, Wolsey received his invitation to court. Bets were placed amongst the courtiers that the king would refuse to speak to him. Instead, Wolsey's old magic seemed to work, and Henry was in a forgiving mood.
Then came the king into the chamber, and standing there under the cloth of estate, my lord kneeled down before him. Then the king took my lord up by both arms and caused him to stand up, and received him with as amiable a cheer as ever he did. Then to behold the countenance of those that had made their wager to the contrary, it would have made you to smile.
But then the king went to dinner with Anne.
The king dined that same day with Mistress Anne Boleyn in her chamber, who kept there an estate more like a queen than a simple maid. And as I heard it reported by them that waited upon the king, Mistress Anne Boleyn was much offended with the king that he had so gently entertained my lord, saying,
What things hath he wrought to your great slander and dishonour? There is never a nobleman within this realm that if he had done but half of what he hath done, he were well worthy to lose his head.
Why then, I perceive, quoth the king, ye are not the cardinal's friend. And so ended their communication. Now ye may perceive the old malice beginneth to break out.
Who would prevail, the minister or the mistress? The next day, Henry and Wolsey met again, but their conversation was never concluded. Instead, Henry was summoned to go hunting with Anne. The king had made his choice.
Wolsey never saw Henry again. Within days, he was stripped of office and, little more than a year later, the cardinal was dying. On his deathbed, the king's minister reflected on the character of the man he'd served so long.
Henry is sure a royal prince, and hath a princely heart, and rather than miss or want any part of his will and appetite, he will put the loss of one half of his realm in danger. For I assure you, I have often kneeled before him in his privy chamber, on my knees a space of an hour or two, to persuade him from his will and appetite. But I have never brought to pass to dissuade him therefrom. Therefore, Mr. Kingston, if it chance hereafter you to be one of his privy council, I warn you to be well advised what matter you put in his head, for you shall never pull it out again.
With Wolsey gone, could Wolsey's other master, the Pope, be far behind? Chapuis, like many other intelligent observers on both sides of the question, had quickly seen that the logic of Henry's dilemma could easily force him to renounce the authority of the Pope. After all, immediately after Campeggio had adjourned the divorce trial, the Duke of Suffolk, Henry's brother-in-law and boon companion, had struck the table and exclaimed that there was never yet legate or cardinal that did good in England.
I need scarcely observe that if these sentiments of the Duke gain ground with the King and the people of this country, there would be a door wide open for the Lutheran heresy to creep into England. I firmly believe that if they had nothing to fear but the Pope's excommunication and malediction, there would be innumerable people in this country who would follow the Duke's advice and make the King and ordinary prelates so many popes.
And Chapuis reported Henry himself seemed increasingly unworried by the threat of excommunication.
Even if His Holiness should do his worst by excommunicating me and so forth, I shall not mind it. For I care not a fig for all his excommunications. Let him follow his own at Rome. I will do here what I think best.
Once, Henry had assembled a team of scholars like Thomas More to help him defend papal power in his book, The Assertio. Now, a similar effort was mounted once again, this time to question the Pope's authority. And the evidence for that effort can still be found here in the British Library. We can see Henry's method in this book, the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, which can be loosely translated as the collection that says it all. It's a compendium, assembled for Henry in 1530 and drawn from a wide range of sources: English history, Anglo-Saxon law, and the Old Testament. But they all add up to make the case, however tendentiously, that the Pope's rule over the English Church was a usurpation of what had once been an independent, self-governing national church. Henry went through the Collectanea with enormous care. It has over 40 marginal notes in his own hand. By the time he'd finished, he'd convinced himself that the Pope in Rome had no legitimate authority in England. Instead, it was Henry, as king, who was rightful head of the English Church.
Now, as touching schism, we are informed by virtuous and learned men that considering what the Church of Rome is, it is no schism to separate from it and adhere to the words of God. The lives of Christ and the Pope are very opposite. Therefore, to follow the Pope is to forsake Christ.
Henry, the theologian and amateur scholar, had convinced himself. Now, Henry the politician had to persuade others. This book, The Glass of the Truth, published by the King's printer in 1531, was part of a sustained propaganda campaign by which Henry sought to persuade the English people that they should reject any foreign jurisdiction, whether of emperor or, in particular, of the Pope. It was the birth of English Euroscepticism, the King's takeover of the Church, framed as an assertion of national sovereignty. And, by and large, it worked. The next year, Henry's new minister, Thomas Cromwell, a former protégé of Wolsey who had stepped into his dead master's shoes, steered legislation through Parliament that forbade all appeals to the Pope, making the king, in effect, the final religious authority in England. Now, confident that Rome could no longer undo anything decided in an English court, Henry instructed his hand-picked Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to make a third trial of his marriage.
The result was truly a foregone conclusion, since by the time that Cranmer got round to declaring Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon invalid, Henry had already married Anne Boleyn in secret, and probably twice over, just to make sure.
This was the final open breach with Rome, and it marks the watershed in Henry's reign and England's history. For 1,000 years, whilst kings had ruled their subjects' bodies, popes had ruled their souls. Now, Henry claimed authority over both. With new legislation, which explicitly made the king supreme head of the church in England, Henry rose to a pinnacle of power unprecedented in Christendom. A power which none of his subjects would be permitted to question, even to doubt. All had now to swear an oath to uphold the royal supremacy, and it was treason to refuse to do so.
Wheresoever any such cankered malice shall either chance to break out, or any to be accused thereof, his highness would have the same tried and thoroughly pursued with as great dexterity and as little favour as their demerits should require.
No mercy was shown, not even to Henry's old friend, Thomas More.
The Act of Parliament is like a sword with two edges. For if a man answer one way, it will confound his soul, and if he answer the other way, it will confound his body.
More refused to accept the supremacy. He kept his soul, but it cost him his head.
Though the king is by nature kind and generously inclined, this Anne has so perverted him that he does not seem the same man.
Henry had come a long way from the Assertio and his old friends. He had embarked on the journey out of love for Anne and the determination to marry her. At first, he thought it would be relatively easy to get what he wanted. Catherine's resistance and Rome's reluctance steadily raised the stakes until the most fundamental questions of church and state were involved. Few of Henry's family and friends were prepared to follow him. Like More, the parting of the ways was a matter of conscience and profound regret. But for Henry, It was treason, and Anne, equally outraged, was on hand to fan the flames of his resentment and turn him, like annealed steel, into something harder, colder, and more brutal than before. At last, King Henry was married to Anne Boleyn, the woman he'd fallen in love with 6 long, frustrating years before. And the marriage, free in Henry's eyes at least from the taint of incest which had damned his first union, would, he fervently believed, quickly produce a son and heir. So, when Ambassador Chapuis was bold enough to tell him to his face that he couldn't even be sure of children, let alone a son, Henry reacted with passion. Am I not a man like any other? Am I not a man? A man like any other? Here indeed was the man behind the king. The king longed for a son. The man was even more desperate to prove his continued virility. Now it rested on Anne, and on Anne alone, to satisfy both king and man.
But Chapuis was proved right. Anne soon gave birth, but to a girl, Elizabeth. A second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Henry's ardour, stoked by long years of denial, quickly cooled.
Some courtiers tell me that for the 3 last months, this king has not spoken 10 times to his concubine. And when the news of her miscarriage was brought to him, he only observed, "I see God will not give me male children."
It wasn't very long since Catherine's failure to produce a male heir had been cited by Henry and Anne as proof positive that Henry's first marriage was displeasing to God. Now, Anne's own failure was leading Henry to draw the same conclusion about his second marriage.
I have been told that the king, in great confidence, and as it were in confession, stated that he had made this latest marriage seduced by witchcraft, and for this reason he considered it null. This was evident because God did not permit him to have any male issue, and that he believed he might take another wife.
The ground was shifting beneath Anne's feet. In March 1536, Chapuis first picked up rumours of a quarrel between Anne and the king's leading advisor, Thomas Cromwell. Chapuis, who hated Anne as a whore and a heretic, was eager to widen the breach. Strike first or be struck, he warned the minister, reminding him that it was Anne who destroyed his old master, Cardinal Wolsey.
I begged him to guard against her attacks more effectually than the cardinal had done. Cromwell seemed to take my words in good part. He began to excuse himself for having promoted the king's marriage to Anne. True it was, he said, that seeing the king was so set upon it, he had paved the way towards it. Although the king's master was still inclined to pay court to ladies, yet it was generally believed that in future he would lead a more moral life than hitherto, a chaste and marital one with his present queen. This Cromwell said to me in such a cold and indifferent manner that I had a strong suspicion that he meant just the contrary. Indeed, I observed whilst he said it, not knowing what mien to put on, he leant against the window, close to where we were both standing, and put his hand to his mouth to prevent a smile on his lip.
Cromwell had seen how Wolsey's failure to end the king's first marriage had led to his downfall. Now, if Henry wanted an end to his second, Cromwell would make sure that he got what he wanted. And this time, there would be no long, drawn-out legal struggle. Blood had been spilled to make Anne's marriage. Blood will be spilled to undo it. At the beginning of May, Cromwell pounced.
Mark Smeaton, a court musician who'd been rash enough to flirt publicly with Anne, was arrested and brutally questioned.
Under torture, Smeaton confessed, no doubt falsely, to adultery with the Queen. A wave of arrests followed, of Anne, her brother, and 3 gentlemen of her circle. The charges of multiple adultery, incest, sexual perversion, and plotting the King's death strained credulity, but in an atmosphere of moral panic and hysteria, all were found guilty. Among those sitting judgment on Anne was her old flame, Henry Percy, now Earl of Northumberland. Percy pronounced her guilty, along with the rest of her peers. But the effort of doing so caused him to be physically sick.
And what of Henry? Anne, it was claimed, had repeatedly cuckolded him with all and sundry, and his sexual prowess had been mocked in open court. Most men would have been shamed. Not Henry.
The king has been heard to say that he believes that upward of 100 gentlemen have had criminal connection with her. You never saw a prince or husband wear his horns more patiently and lightly than this one does. I leave you to give the cause of it.
Here, at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, is the best portrait of the man who so perplexed Chapuis and us. The original was painted by Hans Holbein in 1537, some 12 months after Anne's execution.
The year before, Henry had fallen heavily from his horse in a tournament. He never jousted again. But since the king continued to eat and drink as heartily as before, he quickly put on weight. In this picture, Holbein's genius turns the king's newly found bulk into an image of crushing authority. And with the Reformation, Henry's power had become crushing indeed.
For if his marriage to Anne had failed to provide the love and the son that he craved, it had given him something that he craved even more, a place in history. Now, unchallenged master of church and state, he'd surpassed all his predecessors to become the most powerful monarch ever to rule in England.
This is the Henry we all remember, the Henry he wanted the world to see. He is also unrecognisable as the slim, charming, brilliant young man of promise that he'd once been.
In the final episode, Henry grows ever more monstrously tyrannical as he remates England in his own image.
To follow in the footsteps of David Starkey and to win some great prizes, go to channel4.com and search for Henry. Tomorrow night from 9 o'clock, Channel 4, Obesity is the very real concern. Our landmark series, The Hospital, concludes. Tonight, location Belfast for The Secret Millionaire.